hidden in her poems, which was all to give voice to the unheard women of Afghanistan. Here I call upon my colleague Claire, who will come and will lead the conference from now on for a few minutes, and then we will have different presentations. Claire Rema.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. The poem sounded truly beautiful, and I'm very sorry that I don't think my presentation will be quite as poetic. As we said earlier today, my name is Claire, and I work for the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. That's a network organisation of approximately 70 organisations in 30 European countries that work to promote the rights of refugees in Europe. A lot of the big organisations that Dr. Nassimi and others of you work with, such as the British Refugee Council, the Dutch Refugee Council, Pro Azul in Germany, are our member agencies. We first heard about your campaign last year when we attended the launch event, and as a European network ourselves, we were very interested in the European nature of your campaign, and we hope to work with you more on this as it develops. Just to tell you a little bit about what's going to happen over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to give a brief introduction into issues for Afghan refugees in Europe. My colleague Anne Batilli, who's also from the European Council of Refugees and Exiles, came from Brussels this morning. She's going to talk a little bit about the situation for Afghan refugees in Greece and show us a short film. I'll return and talk a little bit about refugee issues for Afghans in Russia and Ukraine, and then we're very lucky to have Shabnam Nassimi, who's going to talk about the situation in the UK and some more ideas for the campaign here. So if I can start by talking a little bit about refugee issues for Afghans in Europe. Some of you may be aware that UNHCR released new figures last week for the numbers of refugees in Europe in 2011. Last year, Afghanistan again became the main country of origin for asylum seekers in industrialised countries, which is basically Europe, New Zealand, Australia, America and Canada, with over 35,000 Afghans seeking asylum, and over 33,000 of those were in Europe. The levels were highest in Germany, where there were nearly 8,000 applications, over 4,000 in Sweden, and other important countries of destination were Austria, Belgium and Turkey. And in all of these three countries, the number of applications more than doubled. Serbia became a new destination country for Afghans fleeing persecution, with 1,700 applications lodged in 2011, compared to only 320 a year earlier, and there were around 1,500 applications in the UK. If you're a refugee coming to Europe from Afghanistan, there's a very large difference between whether you are recognised as a refugee, depending in what country you end up in. UNHCR again has published statistics for 2010, and if you were an Afghan refugee who applied for asylum in Belgium, there was a 35.6% recognition rate before you appealed. So 35.6% of everybody who came was recognised as a refugee. Whereas in the Netherlands, unfortunately, that figure was 2.6%. So you can see that there is a huge difference. At ECRE, we talk a lot about the common European asylum system, but in fact, the features are not so common depending which country you apply for asylum in. The UNHCR statistics don't go into reasons as to why more people are fleeing every year from Afghanistan, but make the obvious point that the continued volatile situation in the country is a major factor. The figures also don't take into account people who've left Afghanistan but have been unable to apply for asylum. And I'm thinking in particular about the awful situation, quite frankly, in Greece within the borders of the EU. And my colleague Anne, who's been recently to Greece and is making a film with the Afghan refugee community there, will talk about that in more detail later. The theme of the conference is obviously empowering women, and I'll try and focus on women refugees where there is information. but these figures don't give a breakdown of whether the principal applicant are men, women or minors. We have talked to refugee community groups and NGOs in some other countries, and we've been told that many women refugees from Afghanistan do arrive with their family. Obviously, there are cases of single females who apply for asylum, usually because of domestic violence, arranged marriages, honour crimes, and single females who arrive with their children. These people, when they come, are usually treated as more vulnerable for obvious reasons and are more eligible to assistance in host countries from governments or UNHCR, depending on who is able to provide assistance. One issue that has affected many refugees in Europe, including Afghan refugees, is the Dublin regulation. This is an EU-level law that identifies which member state is responsible for the examination of someone's claim when they come to Europe. It's usually the state where the person arrives, so if you come across the border from Turkey into Greece, for example, or it's the country that issues your visa or gives you the opportunity to come to Europe. The aims of the Dublin regulation is to ensure that there's a member state responsible for everybody who seeks protection in Europe. It's to stop people putting in different applications in different countries and to ensure that people have access to asylum procedures. That's the theory. Unfortunately, in practice, it can lead to serious violations of people's rights, long delays in people's asylum claims being examined, people put in detention, often unnecessarily, to enforce transfers of people and their families to different countries. Families can be separated, and there's very little opportunity for people to appeal if they are subject to a transfer order. It can also stop people being able to integrate in the country of their choice if they're forced to apply for asylum in a country where they have no particular connections or relatives or friends. The Dublin system is currently being reviewed by the EU. It's being recast in order to improve its efficiency, which they say is to ensure higher standards of protection for refugees. Our organisation has been actively lobbying for the Dublin regulation to be scrapped. Unfortunately, as we talked this morning, there are long-term aims and short-term aims. In the short term, it's very unlikely that European governments would be interested in scrapping the Dublin regulation, so we're trying to work with legislators to ensure that there are better rights for refugees included in there. There's a lot of complaints about the Dublin system, and I mention this in the case of Afghan refugees because, again, up until recently, it particularly affected people who arrived in the EU through Greece. There have been challenges in the courts, and this culminated in the ruling of a case called MSS versus Belgium and Greece at the European Court of Human Rights. And it was an Afghan asylum seeker who arrived in Europe in Greece and moved on to Belgium to apply for asylum. And he took Belgium and Greece to court because Belgium wanted to transfer him back to Greece. And the ruling was that the conditions in Greece were so bad that they amounted to a violation of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is inhumane and degrading treatment. And so Belgium was in violation of the convention. Since this case, the only EU countries who are still sending asylum seekers back to Greece through the Dublin system are Bulgaria and Sweden, and they're in quite limited numbers. Another issue that affects Afghan refugees in Europe is the subject of unaccompanied minors. These are children who are under 18, outside of their country of origin, who've been separated from both their parents or from other relatives and are not being cared for by an adult, who by law or custom is responsible for looking after them. At any one time, there may be as many as 100,000 unaccompanied migrant children in Europe, mostly in EU countries. And this is a priority in the migration strategy of the EU. Most unaccompanied children arriving in the EU are actually boys, aged 14 or over, and Afghanistan again is one of the top countries of origin for these children. There was a recent study by UNHCR, I keep saying UNHCR just in case people aren't aware, it's the UN High Commission for Refugees, the UN agency that protects the rights of refugees in the world. A recent study by UNHCR on asylum-seeking Afghan children revealed that very few children had the initial intention of leaving Afghanistan for Europe. Over half of the people who ended up in Sweden originally wanted to go to neighbouring countries such as Iran and Pakistan, where they felt that they, based on rational, they had the best opportunities for survival. The final destination of many children in Europe seems to frequently be decided at a later stage once they've already arrived. Unfortunately, the issue of unaccompanied children leads us to the issue of return, as there have been very worrying links between these two issues recently made by European governments. There's a new initiative called ERPUM, the European Return Platform for Unaccompanied Minors, and it's a project run by the Swedish, Dutch, Norwegian and UK authorities to find new ways to return unaccompanied minors back to their countries of origin once they've received a final rejection of their asylum application. It's partly funded by the European Return Fund, which is the European Commission, and the Swedish Migration Board manages the project. The project's aim is to develop a humane and safe return process for unaccompanied minors and to make sure minors are reunited with their parents, but also to find safe and adequate shelter in the country of origin. The main target country of this programme is Afghanistan, and they hope to include Iraq at a later stage. Our organisation has expressed grave concerns about countries planning to return children to Afghanistan where there is little or actually no infrastructure to support them upon arrival, and there are also serious difficulties in tracing family members. Another case that we came across recently in the field of return was from the Netherlands. There was a 14-year-old Afghan girl, Sahar, who has led to the creation of a whole new policy term of being too westernised to be returned. Sahar came to the Netherlands from Afghanistan with her family when she was 3. The asylum request took over 10 years to process. In the meantime, she attended grammar school, spoke perfect Dutch, and wore orange when the Dutch national team played. And the Dutch asylum authorities tried to decide whether a girl like Sahar could be returned to Afghanistan, where the position of women was so different. And the asylum minister, Gerd Leers, last week said no, she couldn't be returned, she should stay because she had become too westernised. And the criteria he gave for this are, number 1, you have to be an Afghan female. Although there are other countries where women have a subordinate position, the situation in Afghanistan, according to the Dutch minister, is much worse. Boys who've become westernised in the Netherlands can go to school in Afghanistan. They're not treated like second-class citizens and can say what they're like. The only proviso he gave on that were boys who are homosexual. The second criteria he gave was that you had to be between 10 and 18 years old to spend at least 8 years in the Netherlands, because he says if you're a 2-year-old child, you've not formed your identity in the Netherlands, whereas the older you get, the more ties you have. He also says that the links with Afghan culture have to be completely severed, and there's a get-out clause, if you like, that the family has not deliberately frustrated the asylum process. Although when an asylum process takes 10 years, I don't know how you can prove whether someone's frustrated it or not. It must be more frustrating for the person actually involved. So that's a brief introduction to the situation for Afghan refugees and women refugees where we have it. My colleague Anne is going to go straight to Greece because we do have a technical issue with the film. She's going to talk about the situation there, and I'll return to discuss some other countries in a minute.
Do not touch anything. I won't breathe. Hello, my name is Anne-Betty Lee. I work with Claire. I'm based in Brussels, and I also work with the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. I will briefly, 5 minutes, talk about Greece and the situation of refugees and asylum seekers. As Claire mentioned, the first refugee community in Greece, as well as the Afghan community. And among these people, there are many women, many families, and single mothers. We went to Greece because we are also developing collaboration with a refugee-led organization, and one group in Greece is very active, and it's called the Greek Forum for Refugees, and it brings together the Afghani community run by Yunus Mohammadi. He couldn't be here today, and it's really a pity. The Sudanese community, the Somali community, the Kurds, and Pakistan community. Our aim was to have a documentary with them, to go to refugees, asylum seekers everywhere on the street, in what they called secret apartments, and to discuss with them and to record their voices. Refugees and asylum seekers in Greece are suffering not only from the European policies such as the Dublin system and the fact that they are basically stuck in Greece, but also from the lack of Greek policies. And there has been no improvement since the MSS case in Greece. The only improvement is the new legislation for the asylum procedure, which is at least an improvement, and one of the first outcome was that the recognition rate for refugees is much higher. But in terms of reception conditions, living conditions, access to health, there's almost, and I wouldn't say almost, there's no improvement. The thing is that we went also there because we wanted to see what will happen if the EU does not decide any measure, solidarity measure, for refugees and asylum seekers in Greece, and especially now in the environment of economical crisis. I will just briefly mention the main issues people are facing there, and then I will let Rihanna speak. There's no reception centers. I would say like 10,000 asylum application, people applying, 1,000 places in reception centers. So people are living on the street. They are eating from garbages. If you go to Athens, you will see unaccompanied minors, Afghan unaccompanied minors, families, women with children just living in parks. There's no reception centers, but they are planning now, the Greek government is planning to open 30 detention centers. And the Greek parliament passed a new amendment a week ago, allowing the detention of irregular migrants on health ground. And for the moment, we do not know what it means. Apparently, it means people with infectious disease from certain countries, not specified, victims of trafficking, and people living in precarity. So definitely, all the people without any accommodation, which means the majority of asylum seekers and refugees will be able to be detained without any other ground. One of the consequence of this situation in Greece is the racism and the number of racist attacks. So people are afraid, and we'll just see now, just to go out. Yunus from the Afghan community edited a map of places people should avoid in Athens. If you do not have any question, I think Rihanna, we met Rihanna in one of these secret apartments. She's there with children and family, and she's really hopeless. That is something also I could add, is the the issue of mental health, because of course there's no proper services to identify vulnerable people and to meet their needs. So there are a huge problem of mental health. And basically, people are really hopeless, including actually Greeks and Greeks NGOs. The thing with Dublin, concretely, is that because people cannot leave Greece, of course they try every day to leave Greece, only people who have enough money, without family, and with taking huge risks, like hiding themselves in drugs, for instance, or taking boats to go to Italy, can leave Greece. But people like Rihanna with children and family definitely cannot leave Greece.